This is the continuation of the discussion of the concepts of good and evil, and how, in many ways, these opposite or opposing concepts are widely paradoxical within theologies, philosophies, and sciences as well. In the first part, I discussed largely the concept of perceptual intelligence, and I mentioned Ken Wilber's work on the spectrum of consciousness and how these schools of thought can be a useful tool in determining perhaps what could be considered as absolute good, or what many would consider to be evil. But we do have a paradox, and what makes it paradoxical is our interpretations of reality. So what is beyond good and evil, that which Nietzsche discussed in his philosophy? I would argue that what is beyond good and evil is the absolute, and it can be confirmed that it exists. Various traditions discuss this concept in different ways and in different languages or ways of thinking, and use different words to describe the same thing. But what is beyond good and evil is that absolute non-dual awareness. And so the paradox lies in the PI, or perceptual intelligence. So I'm going to briefly discuss these and share some information from some articles, and perhaps quote from the book, The Spectrum of Consciousness, to perhaps nail down exactly what it means to think beyond the realms of dualistic thought, and even to break through the paradox that we call the problem of evil, or the paradox of good and evil in our world. Paradox, one's heresy, is also another's truth. One's quote-unquote evil, it seems, is another's quote-unquote good. Depending, of course, upon culture, tradition, education, and many other factors. What some earthly cultures call good is what some other earthly cultures consider a grave evil. What's blasphemy to some is good and holy to another. So in an attempt to nail down what can be objectively defined as good and evil, we have our scriptures, and it does a fairly good job. It is within its realm of dualistic thought. But Scripture also teaches the concept of non-dualism as well. Scripture allows us to demarcate between good and evil via the gift of discernment, which is a named spiritual gift that not all individuals possess. Therefore, education in biblical hermeneutics is necessary to acquire the ability to not blur the obvious distinctions which reason alone cannot truly know. Spiritual discernment is a gift from God. And we have quite an accurate picture of this in the first epistle of the Apostle Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 2, where we read, verse 9, "But as it is written, eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him." So this is saying that this is something beyond the five senses or that man can conceive of. But God hath revealed them unto us by his Spirit, for the Spirit searches all things, yea, the deep things of God. For what man knoweth the things of a man, save the spirit of man which is in him? Even so the things of God knoweth no man, but by the Spirit of God. So these things can be known, but not by man alone. The Spirit of God must reveal them. And so the discernment between good and evil is a gift from God. No man can know, no eye has seen. Verse 12, "Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit which is of God, that we might know the things that are freely given to us of God. Which things also we speak, not in words which man's wisdom alone teacheth, but which the Holy Spirit teacheth, comparing spiritual things with spiritual. But the natural man receives not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him. Neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. But he that is spiritual judgeth all things, yet he himself is judged of no man. He that is spiritual is of God, obviously, and no man has the liberty to judge God. It is God who is judge of men. For who hath known the mind of the Lord, that he may instruct him? And then Paul says, but we have the mind of Christ. So, to look beyond dualism of good and evil, to have the mind of Christ, we can say, I and my Father are one. If you have seen me, you've seen the Father also. That self-same Spirit that existed in Jesus Christ also lives in us. And it is that Spirit that allows us to demarcate what God considers good and what God considers evil. And that not of ourselves. The written word, and all the much more, the spoken word, as faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Philosophy, however, not to leave theology out of the overall discussion, the very concept of good and evil, or the problem of evil, which philosophy also attempts to tackle, has pondered over the centuries in vague and ambiguous, and in many ways is paradoxical. It is imperative, then, that theology and philosophy work in tangent so that a deeper discernment be acquired to tackle the said, quote-unquote, problem of evil, or problems of evil, if you will. So in a tallying of the great spiritual traditions, namely Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, and Hinduism, Taoism, among others, there are concepts known as non-dualism, dualism, and monism. The search for an ultimate first cause comes to an end when one locates that first cause in an immanent principle of activity within all entities rather than in some separate, transcendent being or entity that religions have called God. So in panentheism and non-dualism, the distinctions between the created and the creator are still intact. It is the combination of immanence and transcendence where we can find the principles of that first cause, an immanent principle of activity within all entities, and not just the one entity separate from all other entities. It is all in panentheistic non-dualism. The parable of the vine and the branches in John chapter 15 is a good example of these concepts at work. We see dualism, non-dualism, and perhaps even hints of monism within this parable. Jesus speaking, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away. So the branch in him that bears no fruit is taken away. There's no attachment to the vine at that point, and there you have the dualism. And every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, that it may bring forth more fruit. Now ye are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, so the branch cannot bear fruit of itself. It must abide in the vine. It must be one with the vine. Otherwise, it has no fruit. Except it abide in the vine, no more can ye except ye abide in me. Christ says, I am the vine, and ye are the branches. Dualism. He that abideth in me, and I in him, immanence and transcendence. The same bringeth forth much fruit, for without me ye can do nothing. So, the concept of symbiotic, non-dual process panentheism is at work within this parable. And if a man abide not in me, dualism. He is cast forth as a branch and is withered, and men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. If ye abide in me, and my words abide in you, you shall ask what ye will, and it shall be done unto you. Herein is my Father glorified, dualism, non-dualism, that ye bear much fruit, so shall ye be my disciples. As the Father hath loved me, so have I loved you. Continue in my love. So that's with perceptual intelligence in mind. Any perception that tends to cut itself off from the vine is illusion. It's a deception, a self-deception at that. Speaking of the lower self. So who is man to think that he can do anything without God? For without me, says Christ, ye can do nothing. So we work through the paradox of good and evil. And I'm going to read an article from LinkedIn. Does good and evil exist? I'd say yes. From a dualistic perspective, it does, indeed. In third-dimensional reality, for sure. But is it all that exists? Can we move beyond good and evil? Or it's a perception that frames reality. Published May 3rd, 2017. Good and evil is a judgment, and we all grow up with such judgments being fed to us from time to time, be it at home or school, to some extent, even corporate behavioral training. I would say good and evil does not exist, and at one level, it surely does not. There is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and there's the tree of life. And I would say that one is indeed illusory to the other. Basics are that it is really no good and evil in the universe. Everything just is. Evil is something of inferior quality compared to something better. Therefore, a lesser good is considered evil when compared with a greater good. When there is no judgment, there is no consideration of something being better or worse than another. Everything is accepted equally as it is. This is relativism, or completely subjective reality. But the point is that to move beyond this good and evil dualism, one must see it for what it is, an illusion. Judgment creates a separation of one thing with another, whereas non-judgment sees the oneness and equality of all things. So here we have perceptual intelligence, or the spectrum of consciousness. When you see from a place of non-judgment, one thing is not considered to be better or worse than another, but it is just different. Therefore, all things can be experienced for the uniqueness and variety that they provide. In order to define what is, we have to know what it is not. Therefore, light and darkness define each other, while good and evil also define each other. We cannot define the quality and quantity of a thing unless we compare it with a different quality and quantity of itself. But all is worth experiencing. Therefore, caring for oneself and caring for others is ultimately the same. We are all one being. Our true self is not our individual selves, ego. True self, or higher self, or Christ self, or God self, but it is the self of all. We and others are the same. If we truly want to take care of others, we must take care of ourselves as well. If we truly want to take care of ourselves, we must take care of others as well. The evil we do to others is the evil we do to ourselves. And the good we do to ourselves is the good we do to others. So I would say good and evil are quantitatively the same, but not qualitatively the same. It's all in our perception that frames reality. And now shifting back to Nietzsche and his work Beyond Good and Evil, what does Nietzsche say in Beyond Good and Evil? In summary, he says that philosophers, government, and religion have tried to impose a morality based on their convenience, and that this morality is not necessarily true because this is a concept that changes through time, cultures, and circumstances. Therefore, people must find their own values in truth and impose their morality and stand out among the masses. What did Nietzsche mean by beyond good and evil? Beyond good and evil means that we should not settle for what philosophers and religions tell us about morals, truth, and values, but go further. Sometimes we impose our vision and vanity and accept something as correct without wondering if it is. He encourages people to be noble free spirits and to stand out among the masses. What is the main idea of beyond good and evil? There is no universalism in morality and truth, although there are, I think, what can be considered universal truths. Values and truths in a specific time may not apply to another time, so each individual must find their truth to lay the foundations of a new ethic, including the distinction of what is good and evil. What kind of book what kind of book is Beyond Good and Evil? Beyond Good and Evil is a philosophical text in which Nietzsche, through small ideas ranging from 1 or 2 lines to a few pages, postulates his thoughts about morality, truth, values, religion, and nationalism, among other topics. Although Nietzsche was ultimately irreligious and atheistic and perhaps nihilistic in his thinking, he was brilliant in introducing these concepts to the world because he noticed that there is indeed a realm of thought, if you will, or no thought for that matter, that is beyond the conceptualizing of good and evil, whether it's religious, cultural, or philosophical in nature. Wikipedia defines problem of evil as follows. the problem of evil in the philosophical question of how to reconcile the existence of evil and suffering within omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient God. There are currently differing definitions of these concepts. The best known presentation of the problem is attributed to Greek philosopher Epicurus. It was popularized by David Hume. Besides the philosophy of religion, the problem of evil is also important to the fields of theology and ethics. There are also many discussions of evil and associated problems in other philosophical fields, such as secular ethics and evolutionary ethics. But as usually understood, the problem of evil is posed in a theological context, which I would say helps us perhaps objectify things more readily if we can rightly demarcate good and evil. I would say Scripture is unmatched in many ways at doing just that. Responses to the problem of evil have traditionally been in three types: refutations, defenses, and theodicies, of which I will get to shortly. The problem of evil is generally formulated in two forms: the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil. The logical form of the argument tries to show a logically impossibility in the coexistence of a God and evil, while the evidential forms tries to show that given the evil in the world, it is improbable that there is an omnipotent, omniscient, and holy good God. And that is what many atheists would argue. So the problem of evil has been extended to non-human life forms to include suffering of non-human animal species from natural evils and human cruelty against them. So if dualism, the concepts of good and evil, are persistent illusions that create the paradox in the first place, the problem of evil can indeed be solved by transcending the perceptual intelligence, or the perception of good and evil, which indeed many have said can be done by recognizing that evil, or the knowledge of good and evil, are illusory and within and on the spectrum of consciousness. So is there a realm beyond good and evil? Yes, indeed. And now to inquire into some of process theologies, or rather theodicy, and its answer thus far to the problem of evil, which I believe, in my assessment, is closest within theology to solving the problem of evil and its apparent paradoxes. Process theodicy, and this is an AI overview, is a modern position that suggests that God is not responsible for evil in the world. Why? Because he is not omnipotent or morally perfect, as classical theism posits. At least it redefines omnipotent and moral perfection. This means that God can't create a perfect universe, so he can only create a universe with the potential for future perfection. So there's potential. And in the process, the divine working is in the activity, more so perhaps the immanence of God than the being of God that is considered transcendent of our universe. Okay. This explains natural evil, and since God is as defined by process and not classical definitions of perfection, perfection is redefined to involve, or to contain rather, the imperfections as well. So a perfect God holds within itself the imperfect universe with a potential for perfection, which is his initial aim. And because God recognizes, or rather values, man's free will, he will not, or will in fact refuse to interfere. And so we have what we call evil within the realm of cause and effect. Although God is completely uncaused. This explains natural evil, and since God is redefined perfection, he can sometimes cause evil and suffering, or in fact not prevent it from occurring. And this is why. This is the answer in process theodicy to the problem of evil, which perhaps more readily solves, more so than does classical theism, I would say. Process theodicy also suggests that evil is not from God and that people should fight against it and do good things. For example, Griffin believes that God and creatures share power, and that God cannot withdraw or suspend it. Theodicy is an argument in the philosophy of religion that attempts to resolve the problem of evil. The term theodicy was coined by German philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Leibniz in 1710. Moving now towards psychology, which could be considered the sciences. I want to read an article entitled The Good-Evil Complex. It's Ethics and Morality. What would life be without it? The Good-Evil Complex. Quote, "We said in an earlier blog entitled Authenticity, Good or Evil, that we will encounter these concepts of good and evil as archetypes when we begin to work on finding the authentic self. What we didn't say there was that for all of us collectively, or for each of us individually, the archetype of good and evil has become a complex. A complex is a cluster of beliefs, often contradictory beliefs accompanied by hopes, fantasies, thoughts, emotions, body sensations, and reactions that can be triggered either externally or internally. These complexes can run our behaviors. An example of a fairly common complex is the mother complex. However, we reacted to mother as a child might become how we react to her today, and to anyone who even mildly reminds us of her, we just go into blind reactive mode. So, for example, if I've lived as a child fearing making my mother mad, then as an adult I might fear making anyone mad to the point that I become an extreme people pleaser. Or perhaps it is just women I need to please, or authority figures. Whatever that reaction is, it comes from the cluster of beliefs, emotions, thoughts, fantasies, and body sensations that become a behavioral reaction. In that same fashion, the good-evil complex operates. So, we've all grown up with parents informing us of what was good and what was bad, what was really good and what was evil. Our parents told us to be good, and we were not always certain what that meant, but we knew that when we were not good, our parents and others told us so, and perhaps they even punished us. Through overt and covert responses to us, they taught us when we should feel guilty, when we should feel good about ourselves. In other words, we learned to measure our behaviors, thoughts, and emotions, and we learned to measure them based on external approbation, affirmation, and condemnation. In the process, we were learning to measure our worth. We became worthy to the extent that we were able to win the approval of significant others, and unworthy to the extent that we were unable to do so. Now, some would say that this is what parents is supposed to do. Parents are supposed to teach their children values, we say. They are supposed to raise children who know the difference between right and wrong. And so we've been doing this thing just this way for centuries. And we look around, we have to admit that perhaps all of our efforts are for naught. For our world has not become less savage or brutal as a result of any of these teachings. Basically, what we are doing is passing down the good-evil complex. We fear, however, that if we don't do this, we will raise evil children who don't know the difference between right and wrong. Little Damians, little antichrists, if you will. But that's just the opposite polarity. It is possible to support the compassionate and truthful responses of a child, and to discipline the harmful or disrespectful responses without making it a measurement of a child's worth. But because we as a collective have not yet learned to do that, we still have many people who are operating out of the good-evil complex. And as we learned in that previous big blog mentioned, we can often identify with this complex so that we live our lives to know ourselves and to be known as quote-unquote good. Or we can live our lives identified with quote-unquote bad or quote-unquote evil, because to do so is tantamount to ceasing to exist. For example, I may run my life based on the belief that good people always serve and protect others. So that's what I do. I always serve and protect others, and I don't permit myself to think much about myself, for to do so would mean that I'm not a good person. Later, of course, I may run into a wall of my resentment over and over again until I get it that good is not necessarily authentic. Or I might live my life in fear that I'm not bad. No one will notice me at all, and without that mirror, I don't really think I really exist. Raised by parents who didn't see me unless I am bad, I become bad as a way of being seen. Being seen, then, to an infant and toddler is the source of our identification. So, unless I'm seen, I can't find an identity, therefore I don't exist. Dependent on the severity of this and the rigidity of the parental responses, the child could grow up to so identify with badness that he must behave worse and worse in order to continue to believe he exists at all. Those are just two of many examples, but the point is that if they didn't have good or evil to identify with, these children might have chosen a more middle way. The good-evil complex makes our choices for us in subtle and unconscious ways all day, every day. So much so, in fact, that we hardly know it's happening. And if we were to notice and question it, we might even say that it's right for us to have this complex. Indeed, we might even believe that the complex is our helper. But that's only because we haven't imagined a life without it. So just for a few minutes, I'd like to challenge us to imagine it. What if our responses could come from our genuine sense of self, so that we might were free to give because we genuinely wished to give, rather than because we ought to give because we think that it is good? What if we could feel our anger and recognize it as simply a message telling us that there is something amiss that needs correction, rather than a bad or negative feeling that ought to either be acted on immediately or pushed out of conscious awareness? What if badness were not an option for an unattended child? What would he do then? Is it possible that without those powerful archetypes hanging around out there for us to choose between, we might just be forced to consider authentic responses? For example, if little Johnny were not being taught that he was bad for seeking attention in the ways that he knew his parents would give it to him, couldn't he be free to say something like, "Why don't you look at me?" And if he did, and badness were still not an option, wouldn't parents have to at least consider that maybe he had a point? Good and Evil and Psychological Science, Irvin Staub, May 1st, 2001, from the Association for Psychological Science, as follows. I read. Good and Evil and Psychological Science. To me, evil means great human destructiveness. Evil can come in an obvious form, such as genocide, or it can come in smaller acts of persistent harm, doing the effects of which accumulate, like parents being hostile and punitive, or a child being picked on by peers day after day for a long time. Goodness means bringing about great benefit to individuals or whole groups. It too can come as an obvious form, like a heroic effort to save someone's life, or great effort in pursuit of significant social change, or in smaller, persistent acts. Nations often act in selfish and destructive ways, but goodness by groups, small and large, does exist. In the cases of nations, goodness often comes from mixed motives, as in the case of the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, but also was aimed at preventing the spread of communism, which paradoxically is good to some and considered evil by others. At other times, as in Somalia, where intervention to help reduce starvation ended in violence and confusion, seemingly altruistic motives come to bad ends. Then what? The work of the Quakers in the abolition of slavery and the village of Le Chambon in France saving thousands of Jews during the Holocaust illustrate goodness born of human values and altruism. What is the role of psychology in relation to goodness and evil? One obvious role is to study the influences that lead to great or persistent acts of harm or benefit. We can study the psychological processes such as anger, hostility, the devaluation of groups of people, empathy and its absence, and a feeling of responsibility for others' welfare that make a person act in destructive or caring ways. We can study the characteristics of persons, cultures, social, political systems, and existing conditions that make either destructive or benevolent behavior likely. What are these processes and characteristics, and how do they evolve? Cultures and social systems influence not only group behavior, but also shape individual psychology. Until not long ago, children were seen in many Western cultures as inherently willful. It was thought that to become good people, there must be broken. Their will must be broken early on, using severe punishment to do so. Such practices enhance the potential for both individual and group violence. I will briefly discuss roles of psychological science in a few specific domains of good and evil: child rearing, the origins of genocide, and healing and reconciliation. Raising caring, non-violent children. On the basis of my own research on child rearing, the research of many others, and my own experiences with the application of research, I believe that we know a great deal about raising caring and non-aggressive children. Affection and nurturance that help fulfill a child's important needs, guidance that is both firm and responsive to the child, democratic and non-punitive, based on values that are explained to children and leading to children to actually engage in behavior that benefits others, are among the important elements. So are the positive peer relations. In our recent work in evaluating children's perception of their lives in school from second grade to high school, we found, as have others, that even in good schools, some children are the object of negative behavior, of bullying by others. Other children are excluded. Both groups report that they experience fewer positive emotions and more negative emotions in school. Bystanders, peers, and teachers mostly remain passive. When they act, children who receive some protection feel better, so do the active bystanders themselves. Psychologists ought to move at this point from piecemeal studies to holistic interventions, carefully evaluated, that aim to foster the development of caring, helpful, and non-aggressive children. Doing so requires working not only with children but also with adults, since it is adults who have to provide affection, nurturance, and guidance. Intervention can center on creating caring schools and with communities that include every child and promote positive peer relations and constructive bystandership. Such intervention would help children who are badly treated and disconnected from people at home and protect children in school. It may even stop such horrors as school shootings. Schools can also call on parents as allies, provide training, and help parents create a supportive community that fosters positive socialization. An important point for me is that intervention is an essential aspect of the work of psychological science. Intervention aims to create a better world, but it is also a means of essential new learning. Only by combining the influences explored, usually individually in controlled research, can we learn whether the whole is what we expect from a combination of the parts. whether the combination of influences usually required to create real change in the world actually does so. Our observation and experience in the course of such interventions and careful evaluation with controls can confirm old knowledge, but it also almost certain to also give rise to new knowledge. Origins of genocide and other group violence. I've studied the origins of genocide and other group violence for a long time. Psychologists, who with some exceptions have just begun in paying attention to this realm, have a great deal to do. Their research has to extend beyond the laboratory. The data we need include economic and political conditions in a society, a history of relationships between groups, such as conflict and enmity, characteristics of cultures, such as devaluation of another group, strong respect for authority, past woundedness, and the absence of pluralism, the actions of leaders, the evolution of increasing harm doing, and the behavior, passivity versus action, of bystanders. All of these have important roles. It is essential to understand the characteristics and psychological processes of individuals and groups. Turning to a group for identity, scapegoating, ideologies, or visions of life that identify enemies, changes in individuals and in group processes in the course of the evolution of increasing harm doing, the psychology of leaders, and reasons for the passivity of internal and external bystanders. These are the proximal influences leading to violence. Just as important is the issue of prevention. Understanding origins points to the avenues for prevention. Some of these origins are not traditionally in the realm of psychology, but ought to be. For example, the passivity of nations encourages perpetrators. But such passivity has psychological elements. For example, the way leaders combine values and interests in decision-making, or the way leaders of genocidal groups make decisions. It is often assumed by political scientists and sociologists that such leaders act to enhance their own power and influence. But I strongly believe that they are impacted by social conditions and culture, as are other members of their group. Their actions are the results of complex psychological processes that arise under violence-generating conditions. We must understand these to ultimately deal with them in preventative ways. And I would add to lessen their cyclic impacts, and perhaps to break the cycle of violence completely. And to sum up the article, skipping forward a couple paragraphs to the very end paragraph will sum this article up. Doing such work is difficult and demanding, but highly rewarding. Working on the prevention of group violence is a field with newly emerging theories, limited experience, and little research. Psychological scientists are much needed to contribute to our knowledge, as well as to actually reduce evil, therefore making it less of a quote-unquote problem, and to promote goodness. So we're dealing with the paradox of good and evil. Another article I'd like to share from vision.org, it speaks of just this thing, the paradox itself. From David Hume, written or posted in the fall of 2023. The paradox of being good and evil. Human beings are capable of such inspiring good and paradoxically of such terrible evil. The why and the how of this contradiction has exercised religions and philosophies of all kinds over the centuries. It is sometimes conceived of as rooted in an ancient battle between good and evil spiritual forces, God, Satan, etc., which eventually drew in lower order physical human beings to do either right or wrong. According to this conception, humans seemed to have little choice in the matter. With such an understanding, what to do to avoid the negative impact on human behavior has remained, unsurprisingly, elusive. But now there's an evolutionary biological explanation that has attracted favorable attention. Based on decades of study of chimpanzees and bamboos, Harvard professor Richard Wrangham believes he has solved the puzzle. While Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed humans are innately good, and Thomas Hobbes that human behavior is innately bad. The Bible, in so many terms, focuses that after the fall of man, humans became inherently evil. And it is that evil nature, or that sin nature, if you will, that is responsible. And that the responsibility for evil isn't solely placed at the feet of God. Humans have free will. Wrangham claims that they are innately good and bad, which is probably more accurate. How so? It all comes down to his parsing of aggression. In the goodness paradox, how evolution made us both more or less violent, he concludes that low tolerance for reactive aggression, hot anger, and high tendency to proactive aggression, cold calculation, explains both peacefulness good and terrible violence evil on the human level. I would say, spiritually speaking, these are descriptions of heaven and hell on earth, or within the human realms. In short, he says, a great oddity about humanity is our moral range, from unspeakable viciousness to heartbreaking generosity. Extremes. Perhaps it's these extremes that perpetuate the paradox as well. Rather than being contradictory, he suggests these forms of aggression are two sides of the same coin. We practice exceptionally low levels of violence in our day-to-day lives, yet we achieve exceptionally high rates of death from violence in our wars. That discrepancy is the goodness paradox. This is not far from Alexander Schlotz. I might get this pronouncements wrong, but either way, his or her comment, quote, the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. Even within the hearts of overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an uprooted small corner of evil. Wrangham arrived at his conclusion not by lengthy personal experience in the Golgog, but of 20 years of thinking about specific primates. Chimpanzees can be very aggressive, but their near relatives are relatively peaceful, one might say domesticated. He theorizes that chimpanzees and bamboos diverged from a common ancestor about 2.1 million years ago. But how does this explain human good and evil? According to this line of thinking, such self-domestication also happened to Homo sapiens, one of the two branches of Homo, being about 300,000 years ago. Thus, we become less reactively aggressive because apparently our ancestors agreed to execute troublemakers. And over thousands of years, this selected for tolerance and lowered hot aggression, yet proactive aggression is also a feature of social control selected for by planned capital punishment and remains part of our makeup. This evolutionary biological line of thinking is materialist. It does not admit of any outside supernatural force. Indeed, by definition, it seems it cannot entertain a non-materialist exploration. Does this mean that such an explanation is invalid? Consider this from brain researcher Robert L. Kuhn, written more than 50 years ago. Evolutionary theorists point to the similarity among human and ape brains to corroborate their views. It is ironic that in reality, they have stumbled onto the most significant scientific observation in history, irrefutably attesting to the non-physical component which converts the output of the human brain into mind. Without this non-physical factor, man could be nothing more than a super ape, more intelligent than the chimp to the same degree that the chimp is more intelligent than a less complex mammal. Are scientists non-believers? It is a common belief that scientists cannot be religious. The two modes of thinking are explaining the world seem opposed to one another, but this opposition is also illusory, I would say. Kuhn expressed his conclusions in quite definite terms. The human brain cannot explain the human mind. There must be a non-physical ingredient, that which I would say religions call consciousness or spirit or God. Beyond our microscopes, test tubes, electrodes, and computers, to the truly open-minded individual, it is fruitless to physically rationalize the uniqueness of mind or pure consciousness, pure awareness. There must be a non-physical essence, a spirit in man, of which the scripture does indeed attest. 2. If there is indeed a non-physical aspect to human beings, then it is not possible that it could be influenced by another non-physical force, another spirit, that what brings aggression and other negative tendencies to the fore is of a non-material origin. Many ancient societies developed their own divergent philosophies about the nature of being human and the origin of evil. From an ancient Hebrew perspective, however, human beings began with the unique spirit in man, neutral regarding good and evil, and with the free will to choose, pursuing only good. But by that same human spirit that largely defines our nature, humans opted to decide for themselves what is good and bad, and opened themselves to external pressures to become corrupted and pursue evil rather than good. From a biblical perspective, that is the history of humanity's first parents, Adam and Eve, and their encounter with a wicked adversarial spirit, also known as Satan, Lucifer, the dragon, the accuser, the adversary, etc. It is this Is this a better explanation for the puzzle of human good and evil? It speaks to Wrongham's proposal regarding the role of self in determining what is uniquely human, affirms that there is good and evil in all human behavior, yet provides a spirit-level answer to experiencing godly good and overcoming malignant evil. And to sum up, I'd like to read a segment from The Spectrum of Consciousness from Ken Wilber from the chapter Reality as Consciousness. So we're dealing with mind in and of itself, which was briefly mentioned in the last article I quoted from. So this dovetails quite well with what I've been speaking about, and is a good way to resolve the paradoxes as well, or the seeming contradiction of what could be considered good and evil. And it all has to do with our varied level of consciousness and perceptual intelligence, is where everything ultimately lies, in the realm of mind, pure consciousness. That is the absolute reality of all that exists. And so to move beyond the conceptualizations of what we consider to be good and evil in the realm of our dualistic world, we need to learn to move beyond those conceptions to find the absolute, and that is where God consciousness lies, or oneness, or a restoration of that oneness with God that existed before the said fall of man from that consciousness, or that spiritual reality, if you will. And so, from the chapter Reality is Consciousness, summing it up, I'm going to pick up on the concluding paragraphs of this chapter, and you can pretty much surmise it for yourself, what it's speaking of. Okay. Quote, in concluding this brief survey of the major branches of this universal tradition, so it was the concepts of dualism and non-dualism were discussed, and branches of universal tradition is referring to various theological and Eastern philosophical positions concerning what the absolute actually is, or what the real reality beyond the illusion of the dualistic mindset, if you will. It's all in the consciousness. We should mention a few general points in outlining the different expressions that the experience of mind only has taken throughout mankind's history. We have dwelled almost exclusively upon the analogical and the negative ways. At a later time, we'll elaborate considerably upon the injunctive way. In doing so, we have presented some of these traditions as if they utilized exclusively either the analogical or the negative or the injunctive way, and this is rarely the case. Most traditions, although they might emphasize one approach over the others, usually use all three. Frequently, when a teacher of one of these traditions is intimating a student, he will begin with the analogical and positive approach, explaining that there is an absolute reality that is in all-powerful and all-knowing, the discovery of which will confer an invincible peace upon the student. This helps the initiate to orient himself, and he begins his search for the ultimate. or relationship to God. More than likely, however, the pupil will get nowhere, for he is clinging consciously or unconsciously to his ideas and analogies about reality with a capital R. And he is therefore confusing the map with the territory. So I would say that an analogy of that could be one is reading the Bible as the map and confusing it for the territory, or what is the absolute, or God. Surely there is a distinction between God itself and the Bible. Continuing, at this point, the master might begin to emphasize the negative approach, explaining that although ideas about reality are useful, nevertheless reality itself is not an idea. And so the student, who by now has had his faith in the absolute awakened by the analogical approach, must now proceed by negating all of his ideas about reality. For they are ultimately hindrances, in the words of Kuamre Swami. There always remains a last step in which the ritual is abandoned and the relative truths of theology denied. As it was by the knowledge of good and evil that man fell from his first high estate, so that it must be from the knowledge of good and evil, from the moral law, that he must be delivered at last. However far one may have gone, there remains a last step to be taken, involving a dissolution of all former values. That is perhaps what it means to move beyond good and evil. Sri Ramana Mashari puts it curtly, quote, "Therefore will come a time when one will have to forget all that one has learned," unquote. Perhaps this is part of the meaning behind the rich biblical symbolism of verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die. In other words, your ideas. It abideth alone, but if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. Or perhaps a picturesque of ego death, or the death of lower self to realize higher self. Or the phrase, "It is no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives within me." And it is expedient for you that I go away, as well as the cloud of unknowings, forgetting, forgetting, forgetting. So also does Lao Tzu announce that learning consists in adding to one's stock day by day. The practice of Tao consists in subtracting day by day. And the whole essence of Buddhism has been summed up as empty one's self. To assist in this dissolution, in this emptying, the injunctive approach is usually then applied, wherein the student is given a set of experiments, which, if followed correctly, will result in his directly experiencing reality as it is, not as it is named or as he thought. Hence, in most traditions, all three approaches, analogical, negative, and injunctive, are utilized with only the emphasis given to each varying somewhat from tradition to tradition. Thus, the Christian mystics have the analogical God, which is omniscient and omnipotent, as well as the Godhead, of which nothing can be said. The Hindus have the analogical Saguna Brahman, which is being, consciousness, bliss, and the negative Nirguna Brahman, which is Neti. Similarly, The Buddhists have the analogical Dharmahatu, as well as the Dharmakaya, universal organism, Sita or absolute mind, etc., as well as the negative sunyata. And naturally, all of these traditions have developed sets of injunctive experiments, so-called spiritual exercises, where all ideas, analogical or negative, are temporarily set aside so as to experience reality directly, or what philosophy and theology communicate as the absolute or God. In sum, our ordinary conception of the world as a complex of things extended in space and succeeding one another in time is only a conventional map of the universe. It is not real. It is not real because this picture painted by symbolic map knowledge depends upon the splitting of the universe into separate things. Are good and evil separate things? Seen in space-time on the one hand and the sphere of things on the other. In order for this to occur, the universe necessarily has to split itself into observer versus observed. And in Brown's words, the universe must become distinct from and therefore false to itself. So, with that said, I would say the concepts of good and evil are each false to themselves, to each one the other. And so there you have the paradox. Thus, our conventional dualistic symbolic pictures are subtle falsifications of the very reality they speak to explain. You must move beyond these. And this is what I think what is meant by the concept of beyond good and evil. But the split is not so much false as illusory. And the philosophies, psychologies, and sciences that depend on it are therefore not wrong, but, in a sense, nonsensical. Man can no more separate himself from the universe and extract knowledge from it than a hand can grab itself or an eye can see itself. But man, relying as he does on dualistic knowledge, attempts the nonsensical and imagines he has succeeded. The result is a picture image of the universe as composed of fragments called things, disjointed in space and time, all alien and foreign to the isolated island of awareness man now imagines himself to be. Thus, lost in his own shadow, confined to its purely abstract and dualistic picture of a map of the cosmos, man forgets entirely what the real world is in its actuality. Yet, inescapably, if it is by the splitting of the universe into seer and seen, knower and known, subject and object, that the universe becomes distinct from and false to itself. So if there is any evil, it would be this persistent illusion of falsity. Then clearly, it is only by understanding that, as Schrödinger puts it, subject and object are only one. There you have the dissolution of dualism and perhaps the realization of non-dualism. That there emerges a realization of the actual world. In other words, man is not separated from that ultimate reality, but via his own fragmented, broken, fallen consciousness. If this be true, then this realization alone can claim the title of absolute truth. Now, this is all these traditions are trying to tell us. See through the illusions that dualistic symbolic knowledge has given us, and thus awaken to the real world. It's like taking the red pill in the Matrix films. Because this real world as whole has no opposite, it is clearly not something that can be defined or grasped, for all symbols have meaning only in terms of their opposites, while the real world has none. Thus, it is called void, sunyata, empty, agnosia, which means only that all thoughts and propositions about reality are void and invalid. At the same time, this is to say that the real world is also void of separate things, since things are products of thought, not reality as such. Thus, the real world is also called the Dharmahatu, the realm wherein supposedly separate things have no real existence, except as inseparably interwoven into the seamless coat of the entire universe. And just because of this, just because reality is seamless coat, not split into subject versus object, not abstracted into separate objects extended in space-time, then the discovery of the real world will make it plainly obvious that what was once thought to be the subject alienated from its objects, what was once thought to be a multiverse of independent things hanging in space and time, all are in fact members of one body. Or, if you prefer, the universe is actually indistinct from itself. Thus, the real world is also called Brahman only, Christ only, suchness only, Tao only, consciousness only, itself only, one only, without a second. The universe is not separate from nor false to itself, except within the realm of dualistic thinking. If reality is inexpressible, it is nevertheless experienceable. But since this experience of the real world is obscured by our concepts about it, and since these concepts rest on the split between the subject that knows versus the concepts that are known, all of these traditions emphatically announce that reality can only be experienced non-dually, without the gap between the knower and the known, for in this manner alone is the universe not delivered up to illusion. This means that reality and your perception of it are one and the same, which R.H. Blythe called the experience by the universe of the universe. Now this awareness we have called the non-dual mode of knowing, the universe knowing itself as itself, that is the absolute. The Father knowing the Son through the Spirit, which are one. And further, since we have suggested that this mode of knowing corresponds with the function, state, or level of consciousness, which we term mind, and since to know reality with a capital R is to be reality, Christ said, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." then we can distill the entire essence of these traditions into the phrase reality as a level of consciousness, or simply reality as mind only. Whether reality is called Brahman, God, the Tao, Dharma, void, the source, or whatever, is of no great concern, for all alike point to that state of non-dual mind, wherein the universe is not split into seer and seen, but that the level of consciousness is not a difficult one to discover, nor is it buried deep within your psyche. Rather, it is very close, very near, and ever present. For pure consciousness and mind is in no way different from you. In a very special sense, in fact, mind is that which at this moment is hearing this and reading this page. And to reiterate a Shakespearean quote, there is no good and evil, but thinking makes it so. That said, in summary, non-dual awareness, in fact, solves the paradox of good and evil.